You learn a lot from other writers. Like, there were writers on Man in the High Castle who won Emmys, or, you know, Martin Scorsese's best friend is another one. You want to really kind of learn from the people around you, and that just makes you better. So I can't say that I have any set process, although right now, as I'm developing something, I have to say I'm a big fan of the John Truby stuff. I think he kind of hits a sweet spot for me.
Genre is really the key to understanding screenwriting today. And it comes from what I call the first rule of Hollywood, which is that Hollywood doesn't buy and sell movie stars, directors, or writers. It buys and sells genres. Now, genres are story forms. And more importantly, they are the all-stars of the story world. They are story forms that have been told over decades, centuries, and in some cases, like with myth, thousands of years. So they've already been worked out, and they've been worked out very, very great detail, and they know exactly how their characters work, they know what their themes are, they know how the plot is going to work, and so on. So it's very, very tight. Now, in order to sell to a worldwide audience, you have to use these different genres, because this is what the audience is really buying. When an audience goes to see one of the big summer blockbuster films, they may not know it in their head, oh, that's a myth-based film, or that's an action film, or a combination of the two, but they know what they like. And that's what's underneath each one of those stories. Avengers, Dark Knight, so on. These are all just basic story forms, basic genres, with a unique skin placed on top. So it's very important, first of all, for the writer to understand what genres they are working in. It's also very important for them to understand how to combine their genres, because almost every film that gets made now is not a single genre. That was decades ago. Now, almost every film that gets made, not just in Hollywood, but in worldwide cinema, is a combination of 2, 3, and sometimes 4 genres. Now, a lot of writers know this. What they don't know, they usually don't know, is that combining genres is very difficult, because each genre has its own hero, its own opponent, its own desire line, theme, and so on. So when you start combining these, typically you end up with chaos. You end up with so many story elements that are unconnected that the script doesn't work. So it's very important to understand how to put these genres together. One final point about this. When a writer is developing a story idea, right at the beginning of the writing process, they come up against the biggest decision that they will have to make, which is, what genre is this story? The biggest reason that writers fail at the premise, and by the way, 99% of scripts fail at the premise line, right at the very first decision in the writing process. The biggest reason it fails is not that it wasn't a good idea, it's that they used the wrong genre to develop the idea. It used to be a very clear distinction between film and television. Film was the big idea with the big spectacle, massive numbers of characters, big epic scale, and so on. Television was the intimate story, very personal, just a very few characters, typically a drama. But because TV has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years in such a radical way, this distinction is now gone. And in fact, the biggest spectacle stories are now in television, not in film. You have a fantasy show like Game of Thrones, which is as big an epic and spectacle as you can get, far bigger even than, say, Lord of the Rings, in terms of the number of characters, the story weaves, all the different storylines that are going on, the literal scope of where this story takes place. I mean, it's a continent, essentially. So, and it's covering multiple seasons. This was the big game change, which is that in television up to about 10 to 15 years ago, when we had almost strictly what were known as standalone shows, detective stories or standalone shows, where we introduce a problem in the opening scene and we solve it by the final scene. And then next week we reset the whole thing and we do it again. That meant that the story scope was about 45 minutes long. Now, about 10 to 15 years ago, writers began to realize the incredible power of the TV medium for story, because they realized that instead of making the single episode the way that we demarcate the story, they realized it's the season that makes the difference. We're going to try to tell a story over an entire season. And so when we had the introduction of these serial shows as opposed to standalone shows, it meant that the scope of television increased radically, because a season is approximately 10 times longer than a single feature film. So that allowed us many more characters. It allowed us to have a much more complex plot. And this changed everything in terms of the type of story ideas that we would have in television versus film. One of the biggest mistakes writers make is in how they create character. And they've heard this about, we need to care about the main character, which is absolutely true. We do want to care about that main character. But how they go about it is often wrong, which is they think that the way that you get an audience to care about a character is you make that character as detailed as possible, meaning we give them as many character traits as we can. This is not the best way to go, because those tend to be very superficial elements of a person. And that's not what makes an audience care about a character. It's interesting that what makes an audience care about a character really comes down to only two things: the weakness, the fundamental weakness of that character, and the character's goal in the story. This is why in my story classes, it's always the first thing I talk about. And they are, by the way, the first two steps of the 7 major story structure steps that I was talking about earlier. Weakness, need of the character. In other words, what is that personal problem inside that is hurting the hero in such a fundamental way that it's ruining their life? It's very deep. And the entire story is going to play out the solving of that problem. The way they're going to solve that problem is by going after a particular goal. They don't know at the beginning that by going after this goal, they will eventually deal with their great internal weakness. But if it's a good story, that's exactly how it will work. Now, I often talk about what I consider to be the most important element of good writing, the mark of a really good storyteller, which is that plot comes from character. Now, those are big words, and a lot of people, you hear that, well, what actually does that mean? It means a lot of things, but the most important thing it means is that you create a goal for your hero, which will eventually force that person to deal with their deep weakness. If you do that, the plot comes from the deep source of the character, and you've told a great story. What we care about is to see a character overcome a deep weakness. Now, the audience thinks that the story is all about the hero achieving his goal, right? Because then we've got success, and that's important. And in most stories, the hero will accomplish his goal by the end of the story. But that is not what the audience is most interested in. They can't tell you this, but we know from lots of experience, hundreds of years of storytelling, that the real fact is not does the hero accomplish the goal, but does the hero overcome the great weakness? Because that's what makes us care about that character. We see them in pain, we see them in trouble, right? If they're already successful, if they're already a good, and in some cases a perfect person, where do they go? Right? There's nothing for them to overcome. So that's why it's so important that we show in the very opening pages of our script the great internal weakness of our character. Now, we may also want to give them qualities that are likable qualities that the audience can also hook onto, but those are not nearly as important as establishing the weakness up front in the story. Rewriting is one of the most misunderstood of all of the major writing steps. Partly because of that famous line that you just stated, writing is rewriting. There is no question that if you want to write a great piece of storytelling, you're going to have to do a lot of rewriting. But that concept that writing is rewriting often makes writers make a huge mistake right at the beginning, which is they think that my first draft, just get it on paper, right? To overcome whatever writing block, just get it down on paper. Don't try to be perfect, right? Because that will just stop you from writing entirely, right? Okay, so they get the script down on paper, and then they think, okay, I'll fix any mistakes in the rewrite. Except that they don't fix the mistakes in the rewrite. What people don't realize is that first draft turns into concrete. When you've actually written it out and it's on paper, in many ways in your mind it solidifies in such a way that it is then very difficult to break that apart and to make the key structural changes that need to be made. This is why, and a lot of writers are shocked when I tell them this, for most scripts, the second draft is worse than the first draft. And it just gets worse from there. And that is because of the approach that they take to the script in the first place. Because when you write that first draft, some fundamental things are going to be embedded in that script. This is why it is so important that writers do a lot of prep work before writing the first draft, starting all the way back with the premise. I always tell writers it is so important to take a tremendous amount of time exploring your premise line, taking weeks to look at just one sentence, right? My one line, one sentence log line, because you can find a lot of the inherent structural problems in your script that you're going to encounter right there in the first sentence. Now, that also means we do a lot of prep work in creating our characters, figuring out our structure, learning the end point of the story before we begin writing, so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that you're going to, again, try to make that first draft perfect. What it does mean is that you're going to be looking at what are the embedded structural problems in this story and try to make the fixes before you actually write the draft. And most of those fixes will occur if you do your prep work. You can get a very good story in the scene list, the scene sequence. Now, this is in many ways, a lot of times writers don't realize what an important step this is in the writing process, the scene list, the scene sequence, because this is the last place before you actually write scenes to see the architecture of your story. For example, I do a lot of story consulting work, and my preference is don't give me a full script. Give me your scene sequence. I can spot 90% of your problems and come up with the solutions right from the scene sequence. Because if I see it as a first draft of a script, I've got all that dialogue. I've got a lot of undergrowth that is hiding the bones of the story. and is keeping me from seeing what is not working and how it could be fixed. So this is why it's so important to do your craft homework before writing the first draft and in that first draft. It will then make the rewriting process so much simpler, and it will guarantee that your second draft is better than your first draft. One more point about rewriting. Because it is so misunderstood, most writers don't understand that rewriting is a set of tools, just like plot, character, and so on. And one of the key tools about rewriting is the order that you rewrite. For example, most writers, the first thing they fix when they're doing a rewrite is the dialogue. It's the last thing you should touch. When I work with a writer on a script, we don't talk about dialogue until the third or fourth draft, because it's all about getting the story right. And that's what you want to focus on in your rewriting, are the steps of finding the structural problems. And the first step in finding the structural problems of your script is go back to the desire line of your story. Make sure that you have a good, strong spine, you have a desire line that will track and drive the story from beginning to end. When I give classes, the most common question is all about, how do I sell my script? Now there's an implication in that question, which is, I already know how to write a good script. The only thing I'm not able to do is sell it. Not so. 99% of writers, they will always talk in Hollywood about it's all about the connection, it's all about who you know. That's so overrated. 99% of writers, when they finally meet somebody who is a useful connection, they don't have the story tools to make that connection pay off. They don't have the craft foundation. So it's all about, this ability to treat writing as a profession. And part of that is I can never know enough about how this craft works. And partly that's because every story is different. I talk to professional writer friends, and we're always amazed. We think, okay, it's going to get easier now. It doesn't. It gets harder. Because the better you get, the higher you set the bar for yourself on your script. Cracking a story is always hard, no matter how much you know, because every story is totally unique. Yeah, there's certain elements that you can use, that you can hang your hat on, you can get a way into the story and so on, but everyone is tough. So that's why this having this professional approach to being a writer, being a storyteller, is so important. It's the only thing that A, makes you successful, but B, gets you through. And I always tell writers this: you can have a lot more ideas in this life than you ever have time to write them as a full-length script or novel. So always write a story that you both care about and that you think will have an appeal to a larger audience. It can always be done. It's always important to have a sense of writing for an audience. In other words, I'm not just writing for myself, I'm not just writing for my immediate family. I want to write a script that a lot of people want to see. But it's very tricky in terms of what steps you take based on that. As I mentioned earlier, it's not about predicting a trend. It's not about predicting what is going to be hot with an audience. It's once you determine certain basic elements that, this can be a commercial story idea, then it's all about forgetting that and getting to what I call the gold of the idea, getting down into what is totally unique about that story idea. Keep in mind, the biggest reason that script failed, I mentioned that 99% of scripts fail at the premise line. when we've only written one sentence. And the biggest reason that they fail is it wasn't an original idea in the first place, right? Yeah, the writers make all kinds of mistakes when it comes to developing that idea, but if you don't start off with an original idea in the first place, it's not going to be an original script. And Hollywood has no interest in that, right? Why are they going to pay the kind of money that is paid for scripts for something that any number of 100, 1,000 people could write? So, and what most writers don't realize is because it's so difficult to dig into an idea and find out what is truly original about it, most writers come up with a premise that is a copy of a movie they saw 6 months ago, or it's a copy of 2 movies that they put together that they saw 6 months ago, right? That doesn't make it original. So it's very important that once you have that idea, that you explore it very deeply, find out what is original about it, and if the idea is not original, it's important that you not write it. Now, this is counter to what most writers do. Most writers, when they come up with an idea, they immediately start writing script pages. It's one of the clearest marks of an amateur. And what happens, of course, is they get 15, 20 pages in, they write themselves into a dead end, they just ruined another idea. Now, over years and years of experience that I've had as a writer and a story consultant, I have found that most ideas should not be written as scripts. And it's exactly the opposite of when I started. When I started, I thought there isn't a story idea that I can't make work as a script, that I can't make work as a full-length story. Over years of experience, I've found just the opposite is the case. That the real value of exploring your premise, taking time to make sure it's original, taking time to find out what the structural problems are inherent to the idea, the big value of that comes from finding out that 9 out of 10 ideas that you have should not be written. Because the single biggest choice that a writer makes in the entire writing process, what story do I write? Not how do I write it? Yeah, there's a lot of decisions that go into that. But the most important decision is, what story do I write in the first place? Most stories are so full of structural problems that are embedded in the idea, they will not be solved. I don't care how good you are at story, you will not solve those problems. So why take months and months and a lot of pain to write that as a full-length script just to find out, oh, I didn't solve those structural problems after writing the script, and I knew what they were right at the beginning, right at the premise idea. That is one of the most important things that you want to figure out, not necessarily right at the premise line, but pretty close, which is, what is the structural endpoint of my story? And a lot of writers ask me this. They say, well, I like to be more creative, is the term that they use, as though figuring out the endpoint or the structure is uncreative. In fact, the opposite is the case. The better you are at structure, the more creative the script. Because what structure does is it allows you to know what will work and what won't work. So that you know, oh, I can take this really cool creative twist here because I've got this structural scaffolding underneath it to support it. Or I don't have it. Right? So that's why knowing that endpoint is one of the, I'd say, 5 most important techniques in all of story. Keep in mind that every story is a journey of learning that the hero takes over the course of that story. And in any journey you take, you cannot take the first step unless you know where you're going to. Otherwise, you're going to walk around in circles. Same is true in the writing process. And just because you figure out the structural endpoint of your story doesn't mean that you can't change that down the road. It just means that it is going to give you a focus point for every other structure step that story is going to take. Cliffhanger is a very important technique in television. And a cliffhanger is simply a moment in the story when the hero is in maximum danger, but instead of playing out that event to its conclusion, we stop it right before it gets resolved. Typically with the hero at their weakest point. They are hanging from a cliff, right? And so why would we have a cliffhanger? What's the value of stopping that scene right there and going to a different storyline? The idea is we're trying to hold the audience so that we can get them to come back. This is why we often get cliffhangers in television right before a commercial, because we want to try to hold on to them so they don't go to another show using the remote control. Now, the way it's written into the script, you don't, of course, say, well, this is a cliffhanger. You need to write anything differently to say that it's a cliffhanger. It is a cliffhanger by virtue of what happens in the action. So the real trick here is not how do you write it in the script. The real trick is how do you set it up in the story. And to do that, what you have to do is have at least one other major action line that you can cut to. You cannot have a cliffhanger if you have a single storyline. So where you'd get it is in a show with multiple storylines that are unfolding simultaneously. And then at the crucial moment, you stop one storyline, jump over to the next storyline. Then you take that to a cliffhanger, jump back to the first line, resolve the cliffhanger there, and take them to the next step. These characters are what I call the in-between characters of a story, because we have on one side the hero and the hero's allies. On the other side, we have the main opponent and any secondary opponents that you may have in the story. Right? These are clear characters in opposition. But one of the keys to plot, if not the key to plot, is surprise, reveal. We want to not only surprise the hero over the course of the story, we want to surprise the audience. That's essentially what plot is. And the question is, well, how do we get reveals? How do we get surprises? We get them a lot of different ways, but one of the most important ways is with these in-between characters. Character who appears to be an ally, but is really an opponent. Somebody who appears to be an opponent, but is really an ally. Every time the audience sees that somebody they thought was one and turns out to be another, well, that's a reveal. That's a plot beat. And that's where the audience goes, oh, yes, that was really great. Thank you. That's the power of plot. And these characters are one of the main ways that we get these surprises for the audience. Now, to see the value of this character, take a look at the Harry Potter stories. And of course, the most obvious example of this is Snape, who switches back and forth between a parent ally and a parent opponent for 7 books. Right? That's how useful this character, this type of character is. Because every time he switches, we surprise the audience. She was able to sustain that source of plot for 7 full books. This is one of the ways that we know that she's a master storyteller. It's just that technique alone. She, of course, had many, many others that she was using, but that's one of the most important. There is no preparation for the psychological difficulty of working in that environment. Yes, the fun of creating story with these other story champions is tremendous, but the politics is intense, the competition is intense. Sometimes there's backstabbing that goes on. I mean, I think anybody who's worked on staff will tell you that. There is a tremendous, very clear hierarchy that you're dealing with, starting at the top with the showrunner, and how that showrunner runs the staff makes all the difference in the world. But you have to be able to attach your ego to the larger world, to the larger goal of making this show and every episode of the show work. And that means not only being part of the team, and especially when you're starting out, being at the low part of the team, it also means the requirement to be able to write other people's characters. And not every writer can do that. That is probably the most difficult part about it, because you have to absolutely submerge yourself into the show creator's vision. And if you can't do that, then you don't want to be writing for television. Certainly at the beginning, you're a small part. Your part will grow, but your part is really it's tremendously egalitarian in the sense that whoever comes up with the best story idea wins. So you can have a tremendous impact on any show that you work for as long as you know your story skills. That's why I always tell writers, that's what you're really training for, is become great at story. Because that's what they're dying for. That's what they have to generate so fast. But where you have to really mold your ego is to understand that anything you create, even your own scripts, will be changed dramatically. And oftentimes, a script that you write that has your name on it, when it finally gets to film, it doesn't have a single word of what you wrote. And if you can't handle that, again, you don't want to write for television. Essentially 24 hours. They eat, sleep, talk story, and write story all the time. I remember we used to have to show up by 10 a.m. And you say, well, that's a late start, except that the earliest we got out of that room was midnight, and typically into 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And then you go home, you get some sleep, just enough time to wake up and go back in and do it for another 12 hours, 12 to 14 hours. And a lot of times 7 days a week. Again, it depends a lot on the showrunner. Certain showrunners, they want to make it a livable experience. They don't want it to be hell to work on the show. And so they try to be very organized, and they try to give you at least 1 day off a week and so on. But if the show is not that organized, or the showrunner doesn't work that way, then you're in it, for 24/7. Again, the upside is that that'll be the greatest training in writing that you will ever get. And once you've gone through it, you are completely changed as a writer. Because, the psychological shock is your biggest problem. Because the requirement to produce quality material that fast is something you have, no matter how much training you've done in the past, no matter how many screenplays you've written, whether you've written novels, plays, and so on, it will not prepare you for what you're about to face. And the psychological hit is the thing you've got to be worried about, especially right at the beginning. It's like being a rookie in anything. When you first get there, first break in, the adaptation that you have to do to what's going on in that world is, and on the writing level, is intense. But it's also, you have to adjust to the psychology of the fact that you literally have no time for personal life. And especially if you're writing for a network show where you have up to 24 episodes per season, by the time you're done with that season, about 9 months, you are this close to being dead. I remember at the end of the season on Jump Street, the head of the studio came to the showrunner and said, and this was one of Fox's early shows, and it in many ways created Fox. It made Fox happen. And so Jump Street with Johnny Depp was super popular. And so the executive came to the showrunner and said, we need 2 more episodes. Well, we'd already done 22, 23, 24 episodes. And the showrunner said, sorry, the horses are dead. We can't get anything more out of them. They just cannot go any farther. That was the kind of intensity that one season produced on the staff. This is one of the common and most important distinctions that is often made when we're talking about writing professionally. But there is a basic misunderstanding that's going on there that is putting these 2 things, in opposition to each other. And in fact, the way I like to look at it is that understanding the craft of writing, a big part of that is dealing with it in a business-like way. Now, when most writers think about the business of story, whether it be in film or television, they're thinking in terms of writing a story, writing an idea that can sell. Big mistake. Nobody can predict what will sell. Nobody can predict what is commercial. And if you try to do that, you will always fail. And you'll have constant frustration for the rest of your life, certainly the rest of your writing life. Instead, what I try to urge writers to do is to approach their craft in a business-like way, which means, first of all, learn the craft. Learn the craft. Don't think it's all about who I know. No, it's all about, is it on the page? Did you write a great script? But then treating your craft in a business-like way also has to do with, can I create this script in a particular genre that the entertainment business is going to buy? There are certain genres, not story ideas, that are commercial. There are certain genres that are more commercial than others. There are certain genres, for example, that we get in television, that we get a lot of. For example, doctor dramas, legal dramas, detective stories. So in treating your craft in a business-like way, it means, how do I take the steps that I need to take to have a career as a writer, to be paid as a writer professionally over many years? In fact, in my TV class, the entire TV class is structured according to the steps that the writer has to go through to make a career out of writing for television. And that includes things like, how do you write your spec script? Which show do you choose to write your spec script for? What must be in that spec script? What are the beats of the genre that you're going to have to hit for that spec script to work, and so on? That's, you can see that in all of those things, craft and being businesslike are the same. And the big problem that I always have with writers who have this tremendous desire to write professionally is they think in the old romantic tradition of, it's all about getting that inspiration from above and somehow just creating this perfectly written or well-structured, well-written script. And that has nothing to do with how A, a great script is written, or B, how a great script is sold. So that's why I put so much emphasis in my classes on taking a business-like approach to your craft. If you want to write professionally, and I love this metaphor, I would love to be the starting point guard for the Lakers, right? But I can't walk onto the court and say, hey, Kobe's injured now, so I'd really like to play. Just because you really want to do it doesn't mean you get to do it. Those players have years of training, and they've approached their sport as a craft where they learned all the skills, they practiced them ad infinitum, and now they're ready to perform at the professional level. storytelling for film and television is at least as competitive as professional sports. So you have to have that same approach in order to succeed.